So to continue the coverage on the little Fate Apocrypha banners that are going on in the JP version of the game right now, instead of doing a video on Semiramis, I actually wanted to take the time to make a video on Mordred Rider, since this is one of the rare times that she's getting a raid up. And as many of you veteran players will know, Mordred Rider is actually really good when it comes to looping her NP. I mean, she was a year 1 servant that was easily capable of looping her NP. And this is before, you know, Nero Bride got even crazier than she is now, before we had Castoria, before Tamamo had all of her buffs. So that just goes to show how good of a looper she was. And she still is a very powerful looper. I think she has a little bit of competition with Habitrot, because Habitrot is a free-to-play arts rider that you can get free NP5. But you do have to get through Lost Belt 6 to do that, which I know not everybody's going to be able to get through the Serranos battle, because it is probably one of the hardest fights in the game. And then you have to have like 18.70 billion friend points to get all 5 of your copies. So I can understand some people being a little off-put at trying to go get Habitrot when Mordred Rider's right there on raid up and you can just try to summon her. And there's also people that probably prefer using Tomboy Artoria over like Little Gremlin Fairy, so that's also an understandable reason to go for Mordred Rider. So in today's video, we're going to talk about her and why she's actually worth summoning for. But before we get into that, if you enjoy FGO content, I upload these videos every single day, and your boy's on that road to 100k. If you want to support your boy on that journey, just hit that like and that subscribe button. It really does help me out and brings us one step closer to hitting 100k. You can also click that join button, where I'm going to be uploading videos for channel members, like challenge quest videos, maybe showing some videos early. And then when we have enough channel members, I'd like to start doing polls for them so they could get exclusive content, like exclusive character videos, maybe some exclusive tier lists, just stuff along those lines. So if that interests you, consider clicking that join button. But with that being said, let's go ahead and dive right into Mordred, starting off with her hits. And I know some people might be a little off-put at the hits that she's got, but do keep in mind she is a year 1 servant. And the most important thing is that she has a very high NP gain stat at 0.71%. This is going to be pretty crucial in letting her loop her NP, because that's pretty much all you're doing with Mordred Rider. You're not really doing anything else except just slapping the NP onto people. NP goes burr with Mordred Rider. Although the funny thing with her skills and her decent natural star gen at 9.2%, and decent quick cards at 3 hits each, and she's got 2 of them, she actually can gen a few stars to play around with if you really want to lean into that. I don't advise it, but it is something that I would kind of keep in the back of my head, because they haven't buffed her at all. That's something you'll notice when we start looking at her skills and her NP. They haven't touched her at all. So they may try to lean into making her this looping arts rider that also has some crit utility maybe in the future. But really, if you look at all of her hits, there's not a whole lot going on here. Even the extra attack is going to be a little lackluster at 4 hits. That's pretty much the average for the extra attack. If you don't know why that's a big deal, the extra attack is a composite card that gens stars, NP, and does big boy damage. When you have a high hit extra attack that also has really high base stats, and by base stats I mean NP gain and star gen to work with, it can, as the kids say, hit different. But with 4 hits, it's really not going to be popping off. I mean, you do have decent NP gain, and, you do have decent star gen, so it's not going to be the worst thing in the world. Level up that app end skill, buff it up by 50%, and then we're talking. But let's move on to some of Mordred Rider's skills. So, skill 1, brace yourselves. This is going to be a really intense skill right here, boys. She's getting 30% arts performance for 3 turns on a 5-turn cooldown. Mic drop. Did you hear that, guys? Absolutely. Let me repeat it in case some of you in the audience might have missed this, right? It's a 30% arts buff that lasts for 3 turns on a 5-turn cooldown, and that's all it does. So this may seem a little underwhelming to some people, because, we live in year 5 of FGO right now. You could just take a look at Ashia Doman's first skill, and you're like, oh my goodness, these servants are becoming super hyper complex units. And then you look at Mordred Rider and you're like, oh, never mind. There is some simple things in life that are still pretty good. Essentially, all you're going to do with this skill is it's going to buff up her NP gain, and it's going to make her arts cards do more damage, and it's also going to help her NP do more damage. You essentially just want to have this up at all times. You are actually in a net positive when it comes to skill cooldown, because the skill is up for 3 turns, and then it's only down for 2, so pretty good, all things considered. They could definitely buff this up. I would like to maybe see a 20% NP damage buff slapped onto this for 3 turns as well. I think that could be really good. Or if they want to make Mordred Rider absolutely cracked, they could give her an NP gain buff, but as you guys know, she really doesn't need it. Honestly, one of the issues with Mordred Rider is that you need to get higher NP copies of her because she loops just fine. I mean, I've had scenarios where she's gotten 100% of her NP back, but she didn't kill any of the enemies, and that's because, as we'll see later, her NP damage really isn't all that high. So I think if they want to slap like an NP damage buff on here, that would actually be really good for her. Her second skill is her survivability skill. It's giving her a turn of evasion, and this is where kind of that star gen thing is kind of coming in, because then she's getting a 50% star gen buff for 1 turn on a 7-turn cooldown. A little bit of an odd skill. Spoiler alert, no crit damage anywhere on Mordred Rider, so I don't exactly know what they were going for this. Maybe they wanted her to be able to front her own stars, so just in case you don't loop with the NP for whatever reason, like maybe you could crit on the arts cards to get some nice refund back, maybe. Really, you're just going to be using this for the survivability. If you don't 3-turn any challenge quest or farming node that you're doing, I guess you have this in the back pocket. Less so when it comes to farming nodes, because as long as you have higher NP copies, you should be clearing just fine. But Mordred Rider does have a lot of meme strategies for a lot of different challenge quests, so her having this survivability is pretty decent. Although do keep in mind, we do live in the age of Castoria right now, where Castoria actually has 2 different ways to keep her allies alive, so you shouldn't really need to use it, but it's nice that she at least has it, right? And then the star gen, I mean, I don't really think that's ever going to come into play. I'd like to maybe see, like, just, I don't know, 100% crit damage for 1 turn slapped onto this. Why not? Give her the ability to do some burst damage, or just make that star gen 3 turns and then maybe 50% crit damage for 3 turns as well. A little bit of star weight and we're cooking. Then finally, there's her third skill. This is an extra layer of survivability that she's getting with her guts. Although it's kind of a weaker guts because you're only reviving with 1k HP. It's not quite some of the more powerful guts that we've been getting, where now certain servants have guts that proc numerous times. Sometimes they proc numerous times and give them buffs, or they have a guts that lasts for a really long time, or a guts that makes them revive with like 5k HP. For all you young whippersnappers, this is how guts used to be. You know, they were just a 1k revive if you were lucky. Sometimes you might have just gotten 1 HP back, so it's definitely fine because she has 2 layers of survivability. If for whatever reason your dodge is down, or the enemy has like sure hit, or they removed your buff, you still have that guts in the back pocket. But the most important thing probably is that 30% battery, because that's going to really help Mordred Rider get started in a lot of her farming nodes. And these 30% batteries actually did get really good with the app end skill buff that came out, because now you can give Mordred Rider a base 20% starting gauge from her app end skill plus this 30%. Technically, she does have a 50% battery for that first turn if you want to look at it that way, which essentially means she has access to all of the really good starting charge CEs, like all of the 50% ones, but the most notable one is going to be Magical Grill of Sapphire. That just kind of makes Mordred Rider go absolute burr because she starts off with 50% NP, and then she also is getting a solid NP gain buff as well. Although that is only when it's max limit broken. If it's not max limit broken, you're only getting 40% starting gauge, but still, I think the NP gain buff is good enough, and then Castoria is going to make it definitely runnable. So yeah, her skill is very, very basic, but you have a solid core and a very nice foundation for a servant there. You have a solid arts buff with a solid cooldown that just needs like another damaging buff in there. I would like to see that NP damage buff that I proposed, but they could also turn it into a charisma. Give her 20% attack to the entire party for 3 turns on top of that. That still fills the same role as double buffing her, and then it gives her a little bit of utility. Maybe give her some crit damage on the second skill, and then I think the third skill is kind of fine. They can kind of do whatever they want on that skill. I mean, they could slap the NP damage buff over there, I guess. Or just maybe have it drop like 30 stars for her to play around with as well. I think that could actually be really interesting. But looking at her NP, it's pretty basic. It's a 5-hit AoE arts NP that, depending on overcharge, has a 50% chance to a 90% chance to drain all enemies' NP gauge by 1. So a pretty good effect for an arts NP. It's why I really like NPs like Galatea's as well, because arts NPs are supposed to be spammed, and so if you can spam these, you have a pretty good chance of keeping your enemy suppressed and not allowing them to NP, which means she has another layer of survivability if you want to look at it that way. But yeah, it is pretty basic. And then you'll notice that she's really not doing a whole lot of damage. In fact, she's one of the weakest AoE riders in the game, which is why if you're going to go ahead and summon for Mordred Rider on this Fate Apocrypha banner, I highly recommend at the very least going for NP2. Or if you can't do that, at least put some grails into her, right? Like, kind of make a conscious decision like that, because she's desperately going to need extra damage wherever she can get it. Because, again, like I said, like when I use Mordred Rider to farm, I have no complaints with her looping ability. And I mean, this is still on NA where we don't even have Castoria. She's doing fine. But my Mordred Rider on NA is NP1. And so sometimes she'll completely loop her NP back but then some of the enemies will still be alive and they'll still have like a decent chunk of their HP, so please at least put some grails into her, maybe some gold foes if you really like Mordred Rider. She is kind of a cutie patootie, so I can understand that, or just at the very least go for NP2 if not higher, because she's desperately going to need it, because if you're just going to go for her for collection purposes, you're just going to go for NP1, you're probably better off just using the free-to-play NP5 Habitrot. But let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. I know Mordred Rider is one of those staple farming servants that everybody really thinks of, but nobody ever really mentions how her damage is quite low and that a lot of the times you see her doing really crazy farming, she is at very high NP levels, so do keep that in mind. You are going to want to do things, or just everything you possibly can, to give her as much damage as possible. But again, love to see your guys' thoughts in the comments down below. With that being said, you guys have yourselves a nice day. Peace. Late, guys.